You're saying Rabbi Joel Zeff at 10 o'clock sharp on a Wednesday morning as we zip along with Zoom with the Friday English Kollel and another series of Shurim for Rabbi Zeff on, just announce your topic again, Rabbi?
Yeah, it is the notion of Torah Sinai, that the Torah is given to Mount Sinai, and the problematic and interesting approach of the Ibn Ezra towards that issue.
There's no new notes, Ken. We're going to use the old notes?
It's the old notes, right? So if you'll just, for those of you who are tuning in, so just you can see the link that has been posted for the sources. Now, just very quickly, we've been exploring the very fundamental notion of Torah Sinai, that it's considered to be one of the 13 principles of faith as articulated by the Rambam, that the Torah is a product of revelation. And we pointed out that that has tremendous implications. The fact that the Rambam thought it was foundational is for a very good reason. One, that if you don't really believe that Hashem gave the Torah, you don't feel particularly compelled to do the mitzvot. And we certainly wouldn't feel compelled to believe that Torah is eternal, right? If it's a product of people's opinions, then got to keep up with the times, right? That the Torah should be able to change. We pointed out last week that there's a more spiritual, perhaps, implication of this notion, and that is that since we don't believe God is a human being, God forbid, and that God is not material in any way, how does one have a relationship with a God which is totally other? And the answer is that God shared his otherwise unknowable will and wisdom with us in the form of Torah, right? That through Torah we can have a relationship with God. If God had not revealed himself to us in Torah, then how could we have a vibrant, real relationship with God except for some kind of total abstraction of, well, look at that beautiful mountain, and since I believe that God made it, so God must be really cool. And that'd be about it, right? That I wouldn't call that a relationship.
But Rabbi, just to ask then,
yeah,
is every word of Torah of the question whether that's the requirement to believe in a God that gave us the revelation, or it could be less than complete Torah? And that's the question.
Yeah, so that's what the Rambam says very, very explicitly. He says that even the most obscure and seemingly inconsequential verses in the Torah are every single word, every single letter, a revelation from God. Because if you open up the door, I think you can appreciate this, to thinking, well, okay, I sort of accept the idea in general, but a verse here, a verse there. So obviously it's a slippery slope. Why don't I say that the prohibition on X, which maybe is not very politically correct, well, that's one of those later verses. God didn't really say that.
And, but isn't the 613 do's and don'ts with all the permutations a different idea of what was revealed rather than every verse of the Torah?
Not according to the Rambam. Like I said, according to the Rambam, every single word, and you can understand, like I said before, because once you say, I don't necessarily have to assume that every word in the Torah was a product of revelation, then who's to say which words are and which ones aren't? Bruce has a mind too, and he's going to go through the Torah, and when it says thou shalt not eat cheeseburgers, but that happens to be something that I wouldn't say Bruce, but maybe someone would like to eat. So that must be one of those verses that was added later. Why not?
So all the verses in the Torah that are after Matan Torah, we'd have to say whatever halachas are given, that was included at the Sinai experience, but the historical events just happen to be recorded later.
Right, and that's the way the Ramban understands it. He says that, like Nachman, right? He says that explicitly in his introduction to the Torah, that all the mitzvot were given at Mount Sinai, but the narratives only up to that historical point, and then subsequent to that, each revelation occurred subsequent to the event. So an event would happen, and then God would reveal to Moshe how to record it. Okay, fine. So this is all well and good. The only problem is along comes the Ibn Ezra. And the Ibn Ezra, sometimes in a cryptic way and sometimes in a not so cryptic way, seems to suggest that let's just say otherwise. He suggests otherwise. And what we're doing is now taking a look at the examples of the Ibn Ezra that he seems to suggest that these verses are, in fact, not from Moshe. Okay. Now, we pointed out last week, and right after this brief review, we're going to then go on. It'll just be another minute till we go on. There's a very, very famous comment for the Ibn Ezra at the very beginning of the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. This is all a review, in which he notes that even though the book of Devarim is a speech, a series of speeches given by Moshe at the end of his life, and it always struck me as just a footnote that Moshe refuses to take the job assignment at the burning bush to go to Egypt and take the Jewish people out because he says he has a speech defect. So at least that's the simple meaning of the expression there in the Torah. He after 40 years, I guess he had a good speech therapist because the speech defect seems to have gone away because he gives these very lengthy speeches at the end of the Torah. But the Torah itself, before he gives the speeches, it has a kind of an introduction, and at least the simple meaning of those verses describes the time and the place of these speeches. So it describes Moshe going up to this mountain. I'm sorry, that's it. We're going to discuss that in a second. It describes the words that Moshe spoke, and it says where he was, that he was on the other side of the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arava, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, and Lavan and Hatzerot V'Dizahav. These are all different places. 11 days from Horev by way of Mount Seir until Kadesh Barnea. And then, so that's in terms of place. And then it actually has also the time when it took place, as the time coordinates. So both spatial and chronological coordinates. And on that introduction to Moshe, so the Ibn Ezra says that when the Torah describes the geographical coordinates, that it took place on the other side of the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arava. So famously, the Ibn Ezra says, this is just a review, he says, if you'll understand the secret of the 12, and also the verse in Devarim that says, and Moshe wrote, and also the verse in Breshit that says the Canaani was then in the land, and also in Breshit when it says on the mount of the Lord, on the mountain that the Lord appears, that's in regards to the binding of Isaac, that story there, and also the verse in Devarim where it says, and his bed was a bed of iron. If you understand those things, takir ha'amet, you'll know the truth. So what we're doing now is we're going to try to understand the truth according to Ibn Ezra, and we started a journey going through every one of those examples that the Ritva, that the Ibn Ezra, they're all Rishonim. What's the difference? That the Ibn Ezra lists as examples of this truth that he's not too thrilled about discussing in a very open way.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I was told by one of my chavrutas that when it says over the Yarden, that it doesn't mean over the Yarden, that's the name of the place. The place was called over the Yarden.
Yeah. So now, I'm so glad you asked that question, because as we go on, I just want to point out that every time the Ibn Ezra explains things the way he explains things, you'll see it's rather shocking and controversial. Imagine how if you were a truly pious and Orthodox Jew like Bruce Markowitz, so could you possibly give a more kosher and, let's say, traditional explanation? And so I'm just giving you a general answer that yes, every single one of these passages, not as if the Ibn Ezra was the first person to notice that there are problematic passages in the Torah, right? Obviously, as long as we've been learning Torah, we've noticed that these are problematic passages, and each one of these passages can be explained, let's call it, in a more traditional way. Okay, we actually saw that in the first example that we saw when it says, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Right? Rashi himself says it doesn't mean then and not now, because in Moshe's time, the Canaanites were still in the land, so that'd be problematic. So he says it means then, but not before it, right? Because the Canaanites themselves were conquerors, illegitimate conquerors who took the land from the descendants of Shem.
So does it lead to the question of why then the Ibn Ezra chooses to give out of the box controversial answers when he could take more kosher answers? Like, why
Yeah,
does he do it?
yeah, good question. So let's hang on to that. Very good question. Let's see if we can answer it as we go along. Maybe at the end we'll try to speculate why it is that he gave these problematic answers.
Rabbi?
Yeah, I think there's an answer. Yes.
Okay, when the first Jews from Africa or from Algiers came to Israel, they used to come with 4 or 5 wives. So what they did is people who came with them, they can keep him, but the kids couldn't marry more than one wife.
Okay.
And it's the reason I know it is because a guy married a girl from Denver, and he told me that when his wife, and her father came, he came with 4 wives, but they wouldn't let him keep more. If he came with 5 or 6 wives, they could keep up to 4 wives, not more. So they had to divorce the other one.
Right. So okay, yeah, interesting story, and thank you for sharing that. Fascinating. Okay, so I just want to go back to now the Ibn Ezra, and so we're going to take a look now at more examples of the Ibn Ezra pointing out problematic verses. So the first one was his cryptic expression, "the secret of the 12." We already explained that last time, that the very last chapter of the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, happens to have 12 verses. The Talmud itself already suggests that the last 8 verses of that particular chapter may have been written, it's a dispute in the Talmud, may have been written by Yehoshua. Why? Because those last 8 verses describe exactly the death of Moshe. It's a little hard to understand how Moshe could be describing his own death. It's a little problematic. So perhaps Yehoshua wrote those verses. So that's one of the suggestions. So Ibn Ezra says, wait a second. Once you say that, why don't we go one step further and say that really the entire Torah, the entire last chapter of Devarim, in other words, all 12 verses, were written by Yehoshua. And there's a very simple reason for that, as we explained last week. And that is because those last 12 verses are describing Moshe going up to this mountain, Har Nevo, and he never comes back. So there was never an opportunity for him to contribute another chapter to the Torah because he's gone and he never comes back. So why don't we just say, instead of the last 8 verses, like one opinion in the Talmud, let's say all 12 verses, and that's what he calls Sod Hashnei Masar in Hebrew, the secret of the 12. And he says that explicitly. It's not, he's not cryptic the way the Ibn Ezra says that. He's very explicit about that. Now, in that same chapter, the last chapter of the entire Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, so the Ibn Ezra makes one more statement, and that is in the 6th verse. You know we're going on. This is new material now. In the 6th verse of that particular chapter, so it says that Hashem buried him, Moshe, in this particular place in Moab, right on the east side of the Jordan River. And the verse ends by saying, "Velo yada ish et kfurato ad hayom hazeh," and no man knows the place of his burial until this day. Now just think about that for a second. What does it mean to say, and no one knows the place of Moshe's burial until this very day? I mean, so the Ibn Ezra points out, Divrei Yehoshua. We're on source number 17 now. This must be the words of Yehoshua. Because to say, and nobody knows where he's buried until this day, obviously implies that we're chronologically removed from the time of Moshe's burial. Until this day, nobody knows where he's buried. Now, interestingly enough, when the Talmud says Yehoshua wrote the last 8 psukim, right? And Ibn Ezra agrees, says the last 12. There's a good reason for Ibn Ezra's saying not just the last 8, but the last 12, because when you say that, like the Talmud suggests, in one opinion, that he wrote the last 8 psukim, you get the impression that Yoshua wrote them immediately. Moshe died, and then Yehoshua wrote that description, those verses. But this verse, which is before the 8, is problematic, right? Because it says, and nobody knows the place he's buried until this day. That doesn't seem to suggest it was the day after Moshe died that Yehoshua wrote down the description of his death. Ad hayom hazeh, until this very day, implies a lot more time has passed. That's why the Ibn Ezra says, and I'm just reading the second half of source number 17, maybe he wrote it at the end of his days, before he died. He's already in Eretz Yisrael, many years have passed. So that makes a lot of sense that Yehoshua wrote this, but not immediately after Moshe died, but before he died, before Yehoshua died. So now you can see how the Ibn Ezra is taking, we'll use a metaphor, the inch that one opinion the Talmud gave him of saying that maybe Yehoshua wrote some of the Torah, right, the last 8 verses, and he took it, he was given an inch and took a mile, right? He's now extending that idea that maybe there's even passages in the Torah that weren't written the next day, right, after Moshe died, but even after the Jews had entered Eretz Yisrael and after all the process of conquering, the whole story of Yehoshua, and that Yehoshua wrote these passages before he died many years later.
Well, why have been limited to Yeshua then?
Well, good question. Fasten your seatbelts. You can make a bracha baruch shekivanta. You can thank God that you have been able to anticipate what the Ibn Ezra is about to do. So, ready? Okay. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to take a look at the next passage, which the Ibn Ezra says is one of his secret passages. And if we understand it, we'll know the truth. And this is source number 18. What's the Torah say there? This is the following. Vayichtov Moshe et HaTorah hazot. And Moshe wrote this Torah. Vayitnah el HaKohanim. And he gave it to the Kohanim, the priests. B'nai Levi, who are from the tribe of Levi, sons of Levi. Hanosim et Aron Brit Hashem, who bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, ve'el ziknei Yisrael, ve'el kol ziknei Yisrael, and to all the elders of Israel. Okay, so this pasuk is describing the Torah's done. That's what it's describing. It's all done. Moshe wrote it down, and then he gave it to the Kohanim. Well, just think about this for a second. How could you have a verse in the Torah which is describing that Moshe finished the Torah? He already had finished it, and he handed it over to the Kohanim, to the priests. Who wrote that? Is that Moshe writing that pasuk? So the Ibn Ezra does not comment on that verse when that verse appears in the Torah. The only place he mentions it is when at the beginning of Devarim he says, if you look at that verse carefully, you'll see that that's another example of this great secret he has. But he doesn't explain any further than that. So now you ready? This is very important what we're about to do. The Ibn Ezra was one of the most cryptic, maybe for good reasons, commentator on the Torah. Very hard to know what he means. He alludes to things, he calls them secrets, right? And even when he doesn't allude to things, where he actually explains things, it's hard to know what he means because he has a very terse Hebrew writing style. Very hard to know what he means. So, as you can imagine, in order to make sure that rabbis don't have to work for a living, they spent a lot of time writing commentaries on commentaries, which are commentaries on commentaries, and those commentaries on commentaries, right? This is the process of Torah that is ongoing and keeps rabbis busy. Okay. The Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah is one of the most commented on of all the commentaries. Rashi probably has more what we call super commentaries than the Ibn Ezra, but I think it's fair to say the Ibn Ezra is probably a close second. Now, you can imagine that those commentaries range from those super commentators who are like Bruce, very angelic, pious, who want to somehow read the Ibn Ezra as being very traditional and bend over backwards to try to somehow explain that what he seems to be saying, he really is not saying. And he actually really does believe that every word in the Torah was, in fact, given to Moshe. On the other hand, you have the commentators that seem to explain the Ibn Ezra in a way which seems to be more pshat, more the simple meaning, what the Ibn Ezra is actually saying. So we're going to be introduced today to what I think is considered to be the best commentary on the Ibn Ezra. If you're looking for a non-apologetic or a non-kosherizing commentary on the Ibn Ezra, but who makes a very compelling case, just what's pshat? What's the Ibn Ezra saying? Simple, right? Without getting worked up about theological issues. This commentary is called Safnat Paneach. That is a strange expression, Safnat Paneach. And just to see if anybody is awake out there, can anybody tell me, and you can open your microphone for this, the where that term Safnat Paneach comes from? The author of this commentary, he called it Safnat Paneach. Weird expression. Where's that come from? Anybody know?
It's Yosef's name given by Paro.
Yosef.
Yeah, excellent. All you who answered that, you're all correct. That was Yosef's name given by Paro, and you can now shut your microphone. So why is it called Safnat Paneach? Why did Paro call it Safnat Paneach? So it's understood as being related to the word safun, hidden. So it's Safnat, safun, hidden. And Paneach is understood to mean to decipher, to decode. In modern Hebrew, we use that word. Lefa'aneach means to figure out, to decode. Okay? So Safnat Paneach is this name of Yosef, which means to uncode that which is hidden. Now, the author of this commentary, his name is Rabbi Yosef ben Eliezer Tuv Elam. That's his name, Rabbi Yosef ben Eliezer Tuv Elam. He lived in the 14th century in Spain. We're not talking about a professor at Harvard right now. We're talking about one of in the period of the Rishonim, of the great medieval scholars in Spain. He had a really tough life. He had to move from place to place. He's a true wandering Jew. So we know that he spent some time in Yerushalayim. He spent some time in Damascus. He came back to Yerushalayim, had a tough life. Why did he call his commentary Safnat Paneach? You can imagine why. Fortunately enough, his name was Yosef. That's great. But even more convenient, just like Yosef was called Safnat Paneach because he could decode, decipher those things that are hidden. In his commentary on the Ibn Ezra, this Yosef is going to decipher and decode that which is hidden, the cryptic commentary of the Ibn Ezra. And we're going to learn passages from the Safnat Paneach as he explains the Ibn Ezra. It's going to require some work, but it'll be worth it. Everybody ready? So look at source 19. So source 19 is the Safnat Paneach explaining why, when the Torah says that Moshe wrote this Torah and he handed it over to the Kohanim, right? And that's the end of the Torah, right? As far as Moshe is concerned, why the Ibn Ezra lists that as one of the problematic passages, which comprises the secret. And if we understand the meaning of these passages, which the Ibn Ezra doesn't necessarily explain, just cites them, that we will understand the truth, as the Ibn Ezra says. Ready for Safnat Paneach? Let's read what he says here. He quotes our verse that Moshe wrote the Torah and gave it to the Kohanim. And he explains, Perush, B'farshat vayelech katuv vayithol Moshe the Torah azot vayitna el Kohanim. It says Moshe wrote this Torah and he gave it to the Kohanim. And now he explains, Ki milat vayichtov v'gam vayitna. It says he wrote, past tense, and he gave it, the Torah, to the Kohanim, past tense. Midiot shekfar nitanach kodem sheniktav zeh pasuk reflects the fact that, in fact, Moshe already gave the Torah, right? And it was written before this pasuk. The pasuk is describing an event which had already taken place. So the Torah, up to that point, existed. Moshe gave it to the Kohanim. He's done writing the Torah. Then who wrote this? Somebody else. Safnat Paneach doesn't speculate who else wrote it, and Ibn Ezra doesn't even comment on it, other than just citing it as an example of, let's just call a spade, and we'll speak like Harvard professors now, a post-Mosaic addition to the Torah. But who wrote it? Maybe Arthur. King Arthur. Okay, I'm being silly. Let's go on to the next example.
Could these rabbis who lived in either a Christian or Muslim society be killed for such blatant talk if it would be out in the open? And there's certain pressures, not even from the Jews, from the non-Jews.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You know, we should appreciate that even non-Jews, Muslims is not such an issue because they think anyway the Torah as we have it was distorted. Right? They think there was something called the Torah, but it's not what we have. Right? So, but for Christians, that is a big problem, right? For sure. I don't know in any kind of factual way, like how much trouble you'd get in, but certainly it's not kosher, even for Christians, to say these kinds of things back then. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the next passage, which Ibn Ezra had cited as an example of this deep, dark secret that if we understand what's going on, that we'll know the truth. And that's the following pasuk. So it's verse 20 now. It's part of the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And at the end there, it says the following: Vayikra Avraham Shem Makomahu Hashem Yireh. And Avram, after the incident took place, he called the name of that place, the Lord will see. Asher Ye'amer Hayom, that there will be said today, Bahar Hashem Yireh, in the mount of the Lord he appears. It's not an easy pasuk to translate, but the important point to keep in mind is that the place is named by Abraham, and then the verse comments that name that we know about today, Asher Ye'amer Hayom. It's like saying that's why we call it today, the place where the Lord appeared. That's what the verse says, Asher Ye'amer Hayom. Can you start to see, if you were Ibn Ezra, where you would take this?
But that can more easily.
It's called, right, the place where the Lord appears because of Abraham many years ago calling it the place the Lord appears. Okay, now, Bruce, I understand that you could give an alternative explanation, and believe me, the other Rishonim do.
Yeah, Avram could have just said it. There's no problem with that.
Okay, well, it's a little problematic to say Asher Hayom, Ye'amer Hayom.
Well,
Hayom,
in real time,
if you say today, that
in real
implies
time, Avram is
that
saying it.
What?
He's commenting in his own lifetime until his day, however many after that actual event, until today. Everyone in my world refers to that event. I mean,
Okay.
like your grandfather referring to the day he left Poland, and he says until today,
so, I mean,
we knew
it's
the
a
name
little
of the
bit
boat.
strange. Put it this way, the reason that's somewhat problematic, let me just try to get rid of this, is that it's hard to understand that in Avram's own lifetime, this was like a famous pilgrimage site, and you see this spot over here, it's called the place the Lord appears because when I was a young lad, which he wasn't, so, right, that not a very easy explanation to give. Furthermore, let me just ask you a question. Intuitively, when does that spot take on great spiritual significance? That you could say, oh, this place where the Lord appears, it already had that status and that name because of something happened at the time of Avraham. I mean, when would you locate, sort of in a natural sense, when this place has that great significance as the place where there's a divine presence, a special divine presence? Just go ahead. You can say it. You won't burn in hell.
I could just see when your grandparent lands at Ellis Island and they write the notes to their future progeny, and they say, until this very day, we still recall the landing at Ellis Island. Who said it? The grandparents. And who are they writing to? For the children. But they're referring to their own life, and they're referring back to when they landed in writing their autobiography.
Okay, so let's take a look at what Safat Paneach has to say, and then I'm going to answer your question, which was your original question of why not just give that kind of answer? Okay, so let's look at Safat Paneach, source number 22. V'tam b'har Hashem Yeraeh, right? The fact that the Ibn Ezra lists that as one of those post-Mosaic editions. Perush. Now he explains. B'tchilat parsha v'dato hi ki har Hashem hu har Moriah. Ibn Ezra interprets, and it makes a lot of sense, that this place, and that's Jewish tradition, that's traditional, it is Har HaMoriah, right? Mount Moriah. Asher Nivnebo Beit HaMikdash. That's the place where the Beit HaMikdash was built. The place of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, is the place of the Beit HaMikdash. Kmo shekatuv b'divrei Hayamim. And it says explicitly in Divrei Hayamim, in conjunction with King Solomon building the Beit HaMikdash. So it says there explicitly that it was Behar HaMoriah. The word Moriah is related to the word which means to appear. It's based upon Avraham calling it Hashem Yireh. Moriah, Yireh. You hear that connection there? So when that verse in Breshit says, Asher Yeamer Hayom, that they'll be said today, right, as if the verse said, that this is Har HaMoriah, the place the Lord's appearing, that's a reference to, oh, my bubby, I can't believe it. When that mountain becomes known because of its association with the Holy Temple, Mount Moriah, let's read on the Safat Paneach. Moshe lo katav b'Torah eza harhu. Moshe himself never identifies the place where the sanctuary is to be built. Not only does he not identify it, presumably he didn't know. Rak katav, whenever the Torah refers to the place where the sanctuary will be rebuilt, it always says, Hamakom asher yivchar, the place that the Lord will choose. That's all Moshe ever says about where the temple will be eventually built. Mashma, it seems from here, Shehu lo yada ezaharhu. Moshe seems to not know where it's going to be. So Moshe doesn't know that the Beit HaMikdash is going to be built in Yerushalayim, Har HaMoriah. Kilo Gilau Hashem ad Yemei David. Hashem didn't reveal that until the time of King David. Only then do we know where the Beit HaMikdash is going to be. The Echamar Bekan Bahar Hashem Yireh. So how does we have a verse with Avraham, which is saying it's going to be in Har HaMoriah, Shemashter Sheyado Moshe. That if it apparently that implies that Moshe knew it, but we know Moshe didn't know it. V'od Shamar Asher Yeamer. We turn the page. Hayom. It also says today. Right? I mentioned that before. Today always implies a distance of time. Shemashmo Kilu Amar Zehu Mashomrim Atabadorenu. So the Safat Paneach, that's like saying, this is what we say now in our generation, many, many hundreds of years later. Shulim L'Regel, when we go on pilgrimage up to the temple, Bahar Hashem Yireh, in the mountain of the Lord, right? This is the mountain where God appears. Lamar, person is going up to celebrate the festival in Yerushalayim, Mishtachavot B'Har Hashem, and he's bowing down on the mountain of the Lord, the place where Lord had presented himself in the time of Abraham already. It's impossible this would be stated in the time of Moshe. That whole reference to this is where God appeared, Har HaMoriah, that only is when you have the Beit HaMikdash. According to this, Moshe didn't write the pasuk. Remember, this is 14th century Spain. This author, Tzadna Panech, who's explaining Ibn Ezra, is way before biblical criticism, and he's not a Harvard professor, right? Now, what? So when who wrote it? Kadvu Nevi'im Achronim must be the very last prophets.
So it's true that the last prophets are wanting to interpret and retrofit their new interpretation back on Bereshit. But that's just an interpretation that's being referred to earlier. It doesn't refute the idea that Avram himself is referring it to that. It's just they can now use it later to justify nicely that this was alluded to by someone who himself had revelation from Hashem. It doesn't say it explicitly anywhere in the Torah, in the Chumash, I mean.
That what? What doesn't it say?
That this spot of the Akedah will be the future temple. Who alludes to this later? Later in Tanakh.
Right.
I mean, another Meforshim.
You're implying some kind of like polemical purpose.
Yes.
That the Nevi'im wanted to justify that the Beit HaMikdash would be here because, after all, that's the place that already in the time that Avram had already alluded to a special divine presence there. So,
and it's very nice. It's very nice. But
okay. So I don't know if I would necessarily imply like a polemical purpose. It could just be that they're sort of honestly testifying that the reason the Beit HaMikdash is here is already alluded to in the time of Abraham, etc. Okay, so like you could be a little bit less sort of insidious about it. Okay, so wow. Okay, I mean, so no. What's interesting about this is look at how far we've come. We went from the Talmud's suggestion that maybe the last 8 psukim were from Yoshua, but like the day after Moshe died. So we went from there to saying no, the entire chapter, the last chapter of Dvarim, was written by Yoshua, but not the day at the end of his life. Now we have a passage in which the Ibn Ezra, based upon the Safnat Paneh's interpretation, which I think is hard to avoid, is saying that forget about Yoshua, that we now have identified a passage in the Torah, by the way, not a passage in Dvarim, a passage in the book of Bereshit, which is a post-Mosaic edition, according to the Ibn Ezra, as interpreted by Safnat Paneh, from the very end of the prophetic period when you already have a Beit HaMikdash. As a matter of fact, not only that, the end of the prophetic period, that's already the prophets who witnessed the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, first Beit HaMikdash. That's late. That's the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed in the year 586 before the Common Era. Like, so we're going to associate it with the 6th century BCE. Wow. Okay. Let's go on. Another passage cited by the Ibn Ezra was very interesting passage. We're now at source number 23. So the Torah describes that the Ammonites fought against this king Og. And listen to the description here. This is in the 3rd chapter in Dvarim, 1st chapter in Deuteronomy, verse 11, source 23. Kirak Og Melech Bashan Nishar Miyetar Rephaim. Only Og, it's also a cryptic verse. Also Og, the king of Bashan, only he remained from the Yeter Rephaim, from these Rephaim, whoever they were. Now it wants to tell you how ferocious this king was. Og, very scary guy. We're going to describe how big he was by how big his bed was. It's kind of an interesting way of describing how big he was. You could say he played for the NBA. He was that big, right? But I guess they didn't have an NBA back then. So we say that his bed was really big. How big was his bed?
They don't like to say multiple wives at the same time, huh?
Excuse me?
They could have just said, he had a lot of women in bed with him at the same time.
Oy vey, oy vey. Hine arso eres barzel. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Hello, he Ramat b'nei Ammon. And behold, it is in Ramat b'nei Ammon. Ramat b'nei Ammon is in Jordan. Like that part of Jordan. And how big was his bed? I'm sure you're interested. Tesha amot orka. It was 9 amot in length. The arba amot ruchba, and it was 4 amot wide. Bamat ish, in the amah, which is a measurement of a man. Okay, that's big. Fine. That's not just king size. That's like
super king size.
Super king size. Super size. For another couple of bucks, you get super sized. Okay. Now, Ibn Ezra said this is one of his proofs of post-Mosaic verses. So let's read how the Tzafnat Paneach explains this. Perush, Hine arso eres barzel, halo Hebrew Ramat b'nei Ammon. Right? It's a bed of iron, and behold, it is in Ramat b'nei Ammon. Mashma'o shehu me'id lahem shehi Ramat b'nei Ammon. So the author of that verse is testifying. And by the way, you want to go see how big he was? You can go to the museum in Ramat b'nei Ammon, and you'll see it. It's huge. We happen to know that Moshe was never in that country, Eretz B'nai Ammon. It says in Dvarim explicitly in chapter 2, verse 37, it says, you never approached the land of B'nai Ammon. So he was never there. He didn't go there as a tourist. He never went to the museums there. He knows nothing about it. So since Moshe was never there, how did he know? How did Moshe know that the bed of Og was there in the National Museum of Bnei Ammon? Now I know that Bruce is saying because he went onto the internet and he was thought, well, maybe someday I'll get to visit there, maybe in another lifetime. And he looked in Travel Advisor under Rabat B'nai Ammon. He read about the National Museum. You could say something like that. To be less silly, you could say Hashem told him so.
If I am going to say this if I am going to follow your logic, I could say the entire Parshat Balak is added later, because how does Moshe know what's going on in Parshat Balak?
Yeah, that's not a problem. Why? Because if Moshe is alive after an event took place, then God is relating to him how to record it subsequent to the event. So I don't have any problems with that, right? This is a different problem. This is saying it's attributing to Moshe knowledge that he couldn't have had. Okay, so since he never was there, how did he know that the bed of Og was there? Ad Yemei David. So now he starts to get more dating. When did the Jewish people enter Rabat B'nai Ammon and go into the museum there? David, in the time of David HaMelech. Sheshalach et Yoav v'kavash et Eretz B'nai Ammon. He sent Yoav and they conquered Eretz B'nai Ammon. Vaz yadu shaita Eretz Og Rabat. And then they said, wow, this amazing National Museum. Look at the bed over there. That was the bed of Og. Whoa, look how big it is in the dimensions, 9 by 4. This guy got a really supersized king there, supersized bed.
Don't Moshe and the Jews conquer that territory in the days of Moshe?
Hang on a second. This is a proof that this verse must have been written after King David, because only then did Jewish people go to that area. Moshe didn't write it. Only one of the later prophets wrote it, just like that previous example that we saw.
I always presumed that they learned this when they conquered the territory of Og and the other king, the two kings.
Yeah,
they conquered the whole territory.
So if you look carefully at the Psukim, you'll see that Rabat B'nai Ammon was not conquered, that particular area. So you have to do
Yeah,
You'll do the homework and
but
you'll see.
where this pasuk is, Og the Bashan was killed a few weeks earlier.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to. It's a good question. I have to look exactly at the psukim. Somehow, I'm sure we can figure this out. I'm sure it's not hard. That
Why would he even need to mention the bed? Because they just killed him. They saw him.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
they just
Good
want to
question.
prove.
I don't have an answer right now for that, but I owe you an answer. But in any case, you understand what the Safta Panech is saying, that this particular place was not conquered until the time of David. Now, we'd have to do the homework to figure out exactly, and I confess I didn't do all the research on that. But I'll take Safta Panech's word for now, at least, that Bnei Israel did not enter that area until King David. Moshe certainly was never there, and therefore the reference makes it seems like it's well known. As everybody knows, that bed in the National Museum. Fine. Let's now go to the next example from the Ibn Ezra. Now, I just want to point out right now before we begin the next example, because it's going to be like a long one. This next one, because what's going to be fascinating about the next one is that the Safta Paneach is now going to deal with all of the theological problems. Like, if Ibn Ezra is really saying what he seems to be saying, he just lost his place in the world to come. Ibn Ezra. I mean, Safta Paneach is just explaining Ibn Ezra. So he may still have his world to come, but Ibn Ezra has lost his place in the world to come. So the Safta Paneach, in a really interesting way, is going to deal with all of the theological intricacies and try to explain them. But before I do that, I just want to answer Bruce's question, which he asked at the beginning of today's session, and in several different forms later on. Why didn't the Ibn Ezra just give the normative traditional explanation of these particular passages? And I think the answer is, it has to do with the way the Ibn Ezra in general approaches Torah. You may have heard that when you look at the range of medieval commentators on the Torah, one way of comparing them is to what extent they interpret the Torah in its natural, contextual way, versus to what extent do they interpret the Torah based upon midrashim, which seem to be not the simple meaning of the Torah, or interpret the Torah in accordance with Kabbalistic interpretations or Hasidic interpretations, right? Later on, not medieval commentators, but later on, right? And you can find a whole range of these types of commentaries, and I like to at least sort of compare them in terms of a gradient from the most natural contextual approach, right? What is its natural meaning versus, the furthest from being natural meaning. Now, I'm going to tell you my personal opinion. This is a footnote, really, on our discussion. If you're attracted to a kind of natural understanding of the Torah, simple shot, right? What's the natural meaning? To my mind, the most outstanding commentator from the medieval period to interpret the Torah is the Rashbam, Rashi's grandson. Okay? And there's a very famous passage in the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, Rashi's grandson. Rashi only had daughters. His daughters married great Torah scholars, and of course, all their children were great scholars and Rashbam. He says he used to have all kinds of conversations. He says this in his commentary. If you look in chapter 37 in Breshit, Lamed Zayin, in the beginning, you'll see this comment of the Rashbam. He says that he would talk shop with his Zeta. He didn't use the word Zeta, his grandfather. And he used to argue with Rashi, his grandfather, because he said to his grandfather, you often say in your commentary that you're not going to quote a particular midrash because even though the midrash exists, you're coming to interpret. Right? Rashi says about himself, I'm coming to interpret Pshuto Shel Mikra, the simple contextual meaning. Rashi himself says that's his guiding principle. But I, the Rashbam, said, look how many times you didn't interpret the Torah in accordance with the simple meaning, and you quote midrashim, which seem to be very far from the simple contextual meaning. And then he says, it's a very controversial sentence in the Rashbam. He says, and my Zayda agreed with me. And he said if he would have had more time, he would have rewritten his commentary. So that's the Rashbam. So the Rashbam, to my mind, if you're looking for pshat, you go to the Rashbam. Interestingly enough, the Ibn Ezra, in my mind, is a second close to the Rashbam. The Ibn Ezra also sees as his job to interpret the simple contextual meaning. That's why, if you start by saying, I'm going to interpret the Torah based upon its simple contextual meaning, you're stuck with all kinds of problems. Like, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Or, and Moshe wrote this Torah and gave it to the Kohanim. Moshe wrote that. Or the description, the last chapter of the Torah, right? That describes him going up to Mount Nevo and dying, etc. Moshe wrote that. You're stuck. Now, they can be explained, but if you assume that you should interpret the Torah according to the simple, natural meaning, you're forced to say things like the Ibn Ezra says, though the Rashbam doesn't. The Rashbam does not say these kinds of explanations. It is possible to say things that are more traditional and yet pshat-oriented. However, I want to make another point about this. When we say, I want to interpret the natural contextual meaning of the Torah, what does that mean? If you assume that the Torah is a book, it's a piece of literature. And even if you assume it's a product of revelation, mostly, or even all of it, but it's written in the form of literature, but by God, right? Then you're going to make certain assumptions about what literature sounds like, and you're going to compare the Torah to what expectations you may have about literature. So one is using the skills of literary analysis that one would use to explain Shakespeare, to explain the Torah, lahavdil. If you make that assumption, then when it says the Canaanite was then in the land, the simple explanation of that is they were then, but not now. That makes it very problematic to say Moshe wrote that verse. But what if I were to assume that though the Torah is written in language, it's in a class of its own. It cannot be compared to a work of human literature because it's a product of God. Not only that, but it has a quality to it by design that no other work of literature has, and that it has to be eternally true. Now, I am sure that Shakespeare would hope that his writing would go down in posterity and would be a classic, and even people many years after he's long gone would read Shakespeare. And he's pretty good at that. People still read Shakespeare. However, even though we read Shakespeare, we certainly see how it reflects and is limited to his times. It reflects his own prejudices. It reflects his experiences, etc. It doesn't claim to be the repository of eternal truth. The Torah does. The Torah claims to be the repository of eternal truth, whether you're living 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago or now or 100 years from now. Whether you're living in South Africa, Yemen, or God forbid, Teaneck, New Jersey. It doesn't matter that your native language is Arabic, Spanish, French, English. The message of the Torah is eternal truth, never changing, and eternally relevant. If you make that assumption, then you don't expect the Torah to be written in the same type of normative patterns that we would find in Shakespeare. And that's the way the traditional commentators, for the most part, the vast most part, interpret the Torah. They don't assume that the Torah is written like any other book. And therefore, they interpret it in ways that are not necessarily natural as a function of the expectations that we would have in secular literature. What's fascinating about the Ibn Ezra is that when the Talmud says, Dibra Torah Lashon Bnei Adam, the Torah speaks the language of men, he takes that rule to the extreme, seeming to say that the Torah is written in the same way that a human being would write a book. And therefore, we're going to use the same critical analyses that we would use on Shakespeare to the Torah. And if we do that, when the Torah says the Canaanite was then in the land, it means then but not now. So that's what seems to be driving the Ibn Ezra, that he approaches the Torah in using naturalistic expectations. We expect the Torah to read like a work of human literature, and we're going to use the same type of analyses when we try to understand the Torah as we would use with secular literature.
So what separates him from the multiple hypothesis theory people who also use natural analysis to evaluate the Torah?
Okay, fantastic question. So Bruce just asked, so then what's the difference between the Ibn Ezra and Wellhausen? You know, the famous German anti-Semite Protestant biblical critic who was one of the originators of the documentary hypothesis that that the whole Torah is composed of all these different documents coming from different time periods that were kind of like lumped together in a not very elegant way, etc. So that's extremely important question. And we're going to analyze that, because what we're going to do next week is we're going to look at how the Tzafnat Paneach struggles with the theological implications of the Ibn Ezra. That will give us the kind of infrastructure to be able to compare how does the Ibn Ezra view the Torah as opposed to Wellhausen. But before we get to Wellhausen, we're going to get to an intermediary personality, and that is Benedict Spinoza, or Baruch Spinoza, who took the Ibn Ezra and said, whoa, the Ibn Ezra already took me this far, I'm going to take it a little bit further. And then, of course, Wellhausen takes Spinoza and takes it even further. And so we're going to be doing that analysis in the next two sessions. And then finally, we're going to take a look at how Rav Kook made sense out of this balagan. Okay? And so that'll be in store for us, Bezrat Hashem, in the next couple of weeks. Don't draw any conclusions until we're done with this analysis. Have a beautiful and kosher Shabbat and a gratitude-full Thanksgiving.
Could I throw one more comment out?
Yes.
We know from the life of Ibn Ezra, he really struggled in making a living. And I wonder if it's a fair assertion
They try to sell his book?
Well, you want to sell your book. And so if you just write like other commentaries, you won't have many buyers perhaps. But if you say something on the edge of controversy, you might actually sell a lot more. And perhaps his publisher suggested, I like your ideas, don't hide them. print them.
Yeah.
Because it'll engender a lot of discussion and you'll sell more books.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So, and Bruce, you are to your core an entrepreneur. And you would say something like that. I'm sure that had nothing to do with Ibn Ezra's motives. He was seeking truth, and he had these naturalistic assumptions about the Torah, and that's but
he didn't have to record and print them. It might have been very dangerous. Saying, why would he actually do it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Keep things quiet. But
we'll try to wrestle with that too, because that I don't want to take Rav Chaim's time. I'll just add one sentence. You'll see by next week that Ibn Ezra is a little strange, because in some places, like the last chapter of Dvarim, he says explicitly, it's not cryptic. He says, right, this all 12 were written by by Yoshua, and then he says, even when it says, and Moshe went up. We don't know till now. We saw it today. We don't know till now the place of his burial till today, right? He says explicitly there that that was written at the end of Yoshua's life. So, but other places he says, "Oh, it's a secret. I'm not going to tell you." And if you see these different sources and you think about them and you speak to Bruce, you'll know the truth, right? So, like, I don't get it. Some places he says explicitly. Some places no, it's cryptic. So what was he afraid of? What's going on?
I'll tell you, that is a book-selling technique.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. That's a cynical statement, but we'll leave it at that. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom. Thank you.